Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Spirit. The ethical order. Legal status. The universal unity into which the living immediate unity of individuality and substance withdraws is the soulless community which has ceased to be the substance, itself unconscious, of individuals, and which they now have the value of selves and substances, possessing a separate being for self. The universal being thus is split up into a mere multiplicity of individuals. This lifeless spirit is an equality, in which all count the same, that is, as person. What in the world of the ethical order was called the hidden divine law has in fact emerged from its inward state into actuality. In the former state, this individual was actual and counted as such, merely as a blood relation of the family. As this particular individual, he was the departed spirit devoid of a self. Now, however, he has emerged from his unreal existence. Because the ethical substance is only the true spirit, the individual therefore withdraws into the certainty of his own self. He is that substance as the positive universal, but his actuality consists in his being a negative universal self. We saw the powers and shapes of the ethical world swallowed up in the simple necessity of a blank destiny. This power of the ethical world is the substance reflected into its simple unitary nature, but that being which is reflected back into itself, that very necessity of blank destiny, is nothing else but the I of self-consciousness. This, therefore, counts henceforth as a being that is in and for itself. To be so acknowledged is its substantiality, but it is an abstract universality because its content is this rigid, unyielding self, not the self that is dissolved in the substance. Personality, then, has stepped out of the life of the ethical substance. It is the independence of consciousness, an independence which has actual validity. The non-actual thought of it, which came from renouncing the actual world, appeared earlier as the stoical self-consciousness. Just as this proceeded from lordship and bondage as the immediate existence of self-consciousness, so personality has proceeded from the immediate life of the spirit, which is the universal dominating will of all, and equally their service of obedience. What was for Stoicism only the abstraction of an intrinsic reality is now an actual world. Stoicism is nothing else but the consciousness which reduces to its abstract form the principle of legal status, an independence that lacks the life of spirit. By its flight from the actual world, it attained only to the thought of independence. It is absolutely for itself in that it does not attach its being to anything that exists, but claims to give up everything that exists and places its existence solely in the unity of pure thought. In the same way, the right of a person is not tied to a richer or more powerful existence of the individual as such, nor again to a universal living spirit, but rather to the pure one of its abstract actuality, or to that one qua self-consciousness in general. Now, just as the abstract independence of Stoicism exhibited the process of its actualization, so too will this last form of independence, personality, recapitulate the process of the first form. The former passes over into the skeptical confusion of consciousness, into a negative rambling, which, lacking any stable form, strays fortuitously from one form of being and thought to another, dissolving them. It is true in its absolute independence, but no less recreating them. It is in fact merely the contradiction of a consciousness which is at once independent and dependent. Personal independence is the sphere of legal right. Personal independence in the sphere of legal right is really a similar general confusion and reciprocal dissolution of this kind, for what counts as absolute essential being is self-consciousness as the sheer empty unity of the person. In contrast to this empty universality, substance has the form of fullness and content, and this content is now set free and is unorganized, for the spirit that subdued it and held it together in its unity is no longer present. This empty unit of the person is therefore in its reality a contingent existence and essentially a process and an action that comes to no lasting result. Like skepticism, the formalism of a legal right is thus by its very nature without a peculiar content of its own. It finds before it manifold existence in the form of possession, and as skepticism did, stamps it with the same abstract universality whereby it is called property. But whereas in skepticism the reality so determined is called an illusory appearance and has only a negative value, in legal right it has a positive value. The negative value consists in the actual having the significance of the self, qua thought, qua the implicit universal. The positive value, in the case of legal right, however, consists in its being mine in the sense of the category or as something whose validity is recognized and actual. Both are the same abstract universal. The actual content or the specific character of what is mine, whether it be an extreme possession, or also the inner riches or poverty of spirit and character, is not contained in this empty form and does not concern it. The content belongs, therefore, to an autonomous power, which is something different from the formal universal, to a power which is arbitrary and capricious. Consciousness of right, therefore, in the very fact of being recognized as having validity, experiences rather the loss of its reality and its complete inessentiality. And to describe an individual as a person is an expression of contempt. The free power of the content determines itself in such a way that the dispersion of the content into a sheer multiplicity of personal atoms is, by the nature of this determinateness, at the same time gathered into a single point, alien to them and soulless as well. The single point is on the one hand, like the unyielding rigidity of their personality, a merely single personality, but in contrast to their empty singleness, it has at the same time the significance for them of the whole content, hence of real essence, and as against their presumably absolute but intrinsically essenceless reality, it is absolute power and absolute actuality. This Lord and Master of the world holds himself in this way to be the absolute person, at the same time embracing within himself the whole of existence, the person for whom there exists no superior spirit. He is a person, but the solitary person who stands over against all the rest. These constitute the real authoritative universality of that person, for the single individual as such is true only as a universal multiplicity of single individuals. Cut off from this multiplicity, the solitary self is in fact the unreal impotent self. At the same time, it is the consciousness of the content which has placed itself in antithesis to that universal personality. But this content, liberated from the negative power controlling it, is the chaos of spiritual powers which in their unfettered freedom become elemental beings raging madly against one another in a frenzy of destructive activity. Their impotent self-consciousness is the defenceless, enclosed arena of their tumult. In this knowledge of himself as the sum and substance of all actual powers, this lord and master of the world is the titanic self-consciousness that thinks of itself as being an actual living God. But, since he is only the formal self which is unable to tame those powers, his activities and self-enjoyment are equally monstrous excesses. The lord of the world becomes really conscious of what he is, namely, the universal power of the actual world in the destructive power he exercises against the self of his subject. So if his subjects, the self stands over against him, for his power is not the union and harmony of spirit in which persons would recognize their own self-consciousness. Rather, they exist as persons on their own account and exclude any continuity with others from the rigid unyieldingness of their atomicity. They exist, therefore, in a merely negative relationship, both to one another and to him who is their bond of connection or continuity. As this continuity, he is the essence and the content of their merely formal self, but a content alien to them, and a hostile being which in reality deprives them of that very thing which they regard as their essential nature, namely the completely empty form of being for self. And again, as this continuity of their personality, he destroys this very personality itself. Legal personality thus learns rather that it is without any substance, since the alien content makes itself authoritative in it, and does so because that content is the reality of such personality. On the other hand, by indulging in this destructive activity, in this insubstantial arena, the lord of the world obtains for himself the consciousness of his complete supremacy. However, this self is a mere laying waste of everything, and therefore merely beside itself, and is really the abandonment of its own self-consciousness. Such, then, is the constitution of that aspect in which self-consciousness, qua absolute being, is actual, but the consciousness that is driven back into itself from this actuality ponders this, its inessential nature. Earlier we saw the historical independence of pure thought pass through skepticism and find its truth in the unhappy consciousness, the truth about what constitutes its own true being. If this knowledge appeared then merely as the one-sided view of consciousness as consciousness, here the actual truth of that view has become apparent. This truth consists in the fact that this universally acknowledged authority of self-consciousness is the reality from which it is alienated. This acknowledgement of its authority is the universal actuality of the self, but this actuality is directly the perversion of the self as well. It is the loss of its essence. The actuality of the self that did not exist in the ethical world has been won by its return into the person. What in the former was harmoniously one now emerges in a developed form, but as alienated from itself.